we can start now. Everyone, I want to say hello. My name is Tyson Yaravani, and I'm one of the directors with the P3 Higher Education Summit. On behalf of our entire team, I want to say welcome and thank you for joining us. We're thrilled to have you here. There's nothing quite like being together face to face, usually in San Diego. It's where we meet, but 2020 had different ideas, and we just couldn't miss the opportunity to come together during this time virtually. So we've built this platform that we're excited to be able to host the event on, and we're excited to share the remarkable program that we have planned this year. Over the next 3 days and across 60 different conversations, we'll be getting into the details of how schools of all sizes and their industry partners are managing and moving forward. We're really humbled to have so many college and university leaders joining us this year to share how they've been responding to all the obvious and not so obvious challenges that our sector is facing, how they've been prioritizing health and the well-being of their students and faculty, and also the larger community. Higher education is a national story, and it's not, usually it only comes up the week of Nobel Prizes, but this time it's different. Oftentimes we're seeing campuses as ground zero for COVID outbreaks, and also a place to which our country is turning for information on responsible COVID response. And hopefully soon, as the world begins the process of planning and preparing for a post-COVID reality and recovery, we think that schools are going to be looked at for leadership and innovation as they kind of lead how our nation will adjust and reconcile and thrive in a new world with perhaps a very different set of drivers and circumstances than what we've enjoyed for such a long time. In our program this year, we're going to be unpacking a lot of the implications of COVID and the current state of affairs. We'll be talking about what's happening on and off campus, the impact of COVID, and also the recession, as well as general interesting secular trends. We're going to look at how these factors are affecting existing projects, university budgets, the nature of design, the role of technology, the relationship to physical space, and what are some new normals, and also long-term strategies that we're seeing higher education leaders start to embrace. The program that we've built is going to go through, I think, the national landscape of what's possible and what's viable. And we're going to answer that specifically in the context of P3 projects. And we have a lot of case studies this year that are focused on health facilities, on housing, on retail, on technology, mobility and transportation, as well as on sustainability and resilience. And there's a lot more, but it's a large program. It's a very, very interesting and I think important one this year. What we are going to be emphasizing in most of these sessions is the perspective of the campus and how university and college administrators are responding to the need to reduce costs, to identify and secure new sources of revenue, how they're thinking about delivery models, technology that they're looking to adopt, and like I said before, with design, but also new methods on construction and different ways to think about capital costs that are associated not just with new facilities, but with operations and maintenance. This year, all of our sessions are going to be both available live and on demand, and we've decided to keep the portal open for the next 30 days. So it'll be all through October and November. So after Thanksgiving, you can even tune in and catch a couple of the sessions maybe you weren't able to get to this week. But we encourage you all to take advantage of what's in front of us because this is a live gathering. And we've had a phenomenal turnout. We have over 1,200 colleges and universities and industry representatives joining us. It's our largest event in the 5 years that we've hosted it. And I think there are some interesting things to consider. One, be social. You guys, to your right is a chat box. Introduce yourself right now. Please state why you're here. Let others know that you're here. Open yourself up to other people reaching out to you. There's a navigation bar at the bottom of the screen, and you can actually on the far right see who's online right now. And not just that, but you can send them a message. So you can talk through our instant messenger, and you can also propose talking face to face. We have a networking hall, which is something that you'll find very interesting. You can sit at any table and immediately engage in a one-to-one or just face-to-face group conversation with other attendees. This is also where we're asking our presenters after their sessions to go. So if you want to have a personal conversation with any of our presenters this year, if they're presenting in room 1, you can find them at the table associated with room 1, and so forth. So it's a nice resource. This is in the networking hall, is where we'll also be having our daily happy hour, which will kick off at the end of each day after the final session. Fortunately, it's BYOB, but we don't limit you to 2 drink tickets. So enjoy that. We'll have it today, tomorrow, and on Friday. Other things that I do want to point out are, in terms of like engaging, take advantage of all the resources that we have with our kind of unique mix of partners in our exhibition hall. There are some phenomenal resources here, as well as in the Resource Center, including some white papers that I think you would find very interesting. One in particular is about the nature of the physical campus that was published recently by our partner KPMG. I encourage you to check that out. But there's a lot of resources there that I think you'd find interesting, and as well at each of the booths of our partners that you can click on, and you can see, you can connect directly with team representatives there, where you can also talk through text and video. And we decided to be a little bit playful. This is a P3 conference, so we decided to create a P3 pumpkin hunt. So the 3 Ps are the 3 pumpkins, and we've hit them. Across the expo hall, we'll hide some pumpkins each day, and if you find them, just go to the help desk and let us know where you found all 3, and then we'll enter you into a raffle where you can win some beer money, I would think, or actually it's a gift card for Amazon. But the Easter egg hunt or the pumpkin hunt is really meant to encourage you to kind of connect with our partners, since we have so many who are making available an incredible amount of resources. And I actually want to thank all of them right now for being our partner. And so I'd like to begin by recognizing our diamond sponsors. So thank you to Balfour Beatty Campus Solutions, and thank you to Capstone Development Partner, also to Graystar for being our partner, and KPMG, as well as Michaels and Swinnerton. So thank you all, our diamond sponsors. And I also want to say thank you to our platinum sponsors, which is American Campus Communities and Becker, as well as Brailsford and Dunleavy and JLL. And then thank you to Plenary and Rise. And thank you to our gold sponsors this year, which are EY and Gilbane. Thank you to Goldman Sachs and Hyatt Brown. Thank you to Hush Blackwell and Johnson Controls. And thank you to KeyBank and Meridium. Thank you to Nossaman and Public Facilities Group, PFG. Thank you to Servitas and Winstead. And I want to recognize our silver sponsors, the Concourse Group, Fitch Ratings, Page, Perkins and Will, as well as Scion, Star America, and Web FM. So thank you, all of our partners. And I also want to specifically recognize our program partner, AI, who has been a very close partner of ours since we started this event back in 2016. They are an association and they have some incredible P3 resources. I encourage you to visit their booth as well. And, they will be working with us on hosting our final session on Friday, which is a where do you go from here kind of synthesis of the program. So please stick around for that. So that's it for me. In terms of being social, we do have some social media, and we encourage you to tweet or just get the word out. The reality is that there are so many more people that are probably interested in what we'll be talking about over the next 3 days than you know than who'll be tuning in. So please share takeaways from the keynotes, from the panels, anything that you find of value. This is not meant to be closed door. I think we really take a collaborative approach with the market with our program too. So please share whatever you think is useful. And if you have any feedback or any questions, we do have a help desk. And we were always interested in hearing what you think we should be doing better. So with that, I am very excited to introduce our opening speaker. And let's get him. And so we're happy to have Dr. TJ Logan. He's the Associate Vice President for Student Affairs with Temple University. Dr. Logan has spent the last 20 years of his career working in higher ed at universities like Kent State, the University of Florida, and Temple University, where he's provided leadership across a spectrum of institutional types and settings. And along with his work at universities, TJ has also frequently consulted partners on the industry side, including his work as Director of On-Campus Planning for MSC University. But perhaps his most interesting work might be his current hosting of The Placemakers, which is a weekly podcast about the future of higher education. It's an incredible podcast. It's a conference series in it unto itself. So I definitely recommend you check that out on Google Play or or wherever you find excellent podcasts. And we're excited to have TJ join us to share some lessons learned about 2020 so far through the conversations he's had, and also to help moderate our opening panel where he's invited some of his favorite guests. There are thoughtful higher education experts who will be sharing their current thoughts and concerns and how they're reading current state of affairs for implications for the long-term future of our industry. So with that, I'm very excited to take down my slides and bring TJ up. And I will remove myself. And TJ, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon to my friends on the East Coast. Good morning to my friends on the West Coast. What a weird year. We're here in 2020 with a lot going on. I'm really excited to join you. I appreciate the warm welcome, Tyson. I don't know if we can get my slides up in sort of the corner there and maybe make me a little bit perfect. That's beautiful. As Tyson mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about lessons learned from the pod. And not only is this a weird year and a weird time for us, I think it's really weird to be doing opening session this way, right? We would all much rather be in sunny San Diego. And if we were, it's very likely I wouldn't be doing an opening address for you, but I am. And the reason I am is not necessarily because I'm a huge thought leader in the higher ed space, but because I've been very fortunate to surround myself with wonderful thought leaders in the higher ed space. And I want to share a little bit about that story and some of the things that we've learned. But I also want to have some of those conversations today is how we'd like to lead this off. I will say we're going to be very, very focused on big ideas. I think oftentimes, particularly
Hi, everyone. We've lost our speaker for just a second. We'll bring him right back on.
All right, I think TJ is back. Let's do this again.
I apologize. Let me share that one more time for you. There we go. All right, I'm back in. If you can put the slides back up, that'd be fantastic. We'll hurry through this. I promise. We'll get to the good stuff. Apologize for the network connection. That's part of the weirdness of 2020, right? So, again, a little bit of history of the pod. If we rewind and we go back, I don't know, 8 months or what feels like 8 years now, you remember the headlines in higher education at the time. The headlines in higher ed at the time were really all about reacting. It was all about responding. It was all about how was this COVID pandemic going to impact the industry? Was housing going to be open? Was campus going to have class? Those types of things. And my colleagues and I, particularly my colleagues at MSC University, we were having bigger discussions about the future of the industry, and we felt like there was a missing bigger discussion about the future of the industry. We didn't feel like there was a focus on where's the industry going to go, a way that makes sense, so that when we do come out the other side of this, that we're in a good position. I did hear a talk yesterday from somebody in the industry talking about, everything's going well. Let's keep our head down. Numbers are okay. Let's burrow our way through. And on the other side of this, everything will go back to normal. Well, I've got news for you. I don't think that's going to happen. And I want to share some trends that may help you do that. Anyways, over the last 8 months, we said, let us have that conversation. And during that time, we've now seen 22 episodes. We've had 54 guests, and we've had thousands of downloads over 17 countries. We didn't do this so that we could make ad revenue. We didn't do this so that I could become a famous podcast host, which I am far from being. We did it because we really wanted to have a relevant conversation. And part of what's come out of that are some big lessons. And that's what I want to spend my time with today. I've brought 3 people with me. I brought Brandon Bustede, who happens to be the president of Kaplan University Partners, and he writes for Forbes and The Economist, amongst other places. I brought Elizabeth Scarborough Johnson, who's chairman and partner at Simpson Scarborough. I brought Kelsey Harmon Finn, who's the CEO of NACIS. These are some of our favorite pod guests, and we're going to have a little conversation. But first, for those folks who have not been listening to the pod and want to catch up a little bit, I want to share 3 big ideas, 3 big trends, and use that as a framework for a conversation with our 3 guests as they join us on stage today. So let's jump right into that, because I know time's going to be a little bit limited as we work our way through. The first is a very, very unpopular thing that I'm going to say. As our good friend Billy Joel said, COVID didn't start the fire. COVID is not changing higher education. Now, you've probably never heard anybody say that. You've probably never heard anybody write that at this point. COVID is not changing higher education. What COVID is doing is it is exposing higher education. At the end of the day, what COVID-19 has done is accelerated existing problems. If we think back to some of the things that we've seen on the podcast, as an example, in episode 1, Alan Blattner came on and he talked about this challenge with silos that's been exposed by higher education. Silos in higher education are much older than the pandemic. That was an existing problem that's only been accelerated and exposed by some of this COVID issue. Episode 7, we had JPK, Jolie Payne Kirchmeier, on from Northwestern University, and she talked about us being too narrowly focused on undergraduate students. Again, that's something we've been doing for years and years and years and years. That's not a new problem. It's just been accelerated and exposed by COVID-19. In episode 3, Clayton Mitchell from Thomas Jefferson talked about wasting space. He told a really great story about how when he walks around on his campus, he often sees buildings that are used during the day that are dead at night, and buildings that are used at night that are dead during the day. And he asks himself, why are we wasting so much infrastructure on our college campuses? That is not a new problem. That's a problem that we've had for a long time. And so COVID is exposing and accelerating things. And I want to give you an example from another industry. If you look at retail as an example, percentage of retail purchases that have happened online have increased 1% per year over the last 10 years. Over the last 10 months, they've gone up 10%. So we've moved at 10 times the speed of what we would see in a normal year. They've gone up 10% over the last 9 months, 8 months. And so what that means for us, if we apply that to higher education, is that at some point, we're going to wake up on the other side of this in the not so distant future. We're going to find ourselves in campus 2030, but we're going to have the problems and the infrastructure and the challenges in place of 2020. And that's the question that we wanted to answer, is how are we going to act and respond and deal with that new campus problem or that new campus challenge or all of those accelerated challenges when we've had no time to react to those things. The second big idea that we've seen out of the pod as a trend is that there is a growing trust gap. And that trust gap is really between a multitude of folks that we work with. It is families, it is students, it is parents, It is the community. It is the general American public. It is companies. When you think about workplace readiness, this growing trust gap, when I think about it from a pod perspective, I think of episode 5. We had students actually on the podcast come on and talk, and they talked about institutions showing their true colors. They talked about institutions and what they value and how those values were driving their decision making. And we even had students say, look, my school clearly only cares about money. They only care about my tuition payment, and that's why they're making the decisions that they're making. Those kinds of conversations have driven a trust gap between higher education as an industry and the customers that it serves. Episode 15, Elizabeth, who's going to join us in a few minutes, talked about lack of transparency in the ways that we were communicating and how that was leading to some of these trust gaps. And I'm going to ask her to share some of that data, hopefully off the top of her head as we get into a conversation. And then in episode 6, we had Kelsey, who's also going to join us, talking about this notion of values-driven decision-making. And that when you look around the world right now, industries do not have the benefit of being value neutral anymore. It's just not a thing that we can do. Nike is taking value stances. Ben & Jerry is taking value stances. Bombas is taking value stances. Higher education needs to be a values-driven industry as well, because it will inform the decisions of our consumers moving forward. And this growing trust gap is contributing to an issue there, and it's been accelerated by COVID, as I said before. The third issue that's come up as some framework is that the ROI on higher ed is a major question. People go to college to earn a degree, but also more than anything is to get a good job when they're all done. And what we're seeing is a decrease in the level of trust and the level of excitement about the work readiness of our students. Brandon Bustede came on episode 8 and talked about some data from Gallup, whereby he said, nobody really believes that students are work ready outside of provosts. C-suite executives don't believe that. Companies don't believe that. That's why they're investing millions of dollars into training for students who have just graduated and are their entry-level professional staff members. Families don't believe it, and students don't believe it. Provosts believe it, but that's about it. And so students are not coming out with a perception of being work ready. On episode 21, we had Nick Bayer join us from Saxby's to talk about his experiential model in higher education and how it's a really unique model, which is sort of sad because it was so high impact. And outside of campuses like, we talk an awful lot about Michael Sorrell and what he's doing at Paul Quinn University. He's aligned everything that they're doing on that campus with getting students work ready. And it happens to be the exception, not the rule. And so there's this feeling that work readiness is not something that's happening in higher education. All of those things are going to catch up to us, and how we address them as an industry, not just from within higher education, but outside and around higher education, is going to inform who's going to be successful. There's less students that are going to be available to us in the next 10 years. And the question is, who's going to win those students? And the people that are going to win them are the people that address these big industry issues in the best ways. And so getting burrowed back into your corner where you're thinking about deal structure on one specific deal and not thinking more broadly about how we're strategically aligning ourselves with the challenges of the industry, I think are going to be a huge disadvantage as we move ourselves forward. So what does all this mean? I think it means a couple of things before we invite our panelists to join us. I think the first thing is that we're not going back. If you're sitting and listening to people talk about just put your head down, we'll get back to normal, whatever that means. I personally, based on everybody that I've spoken to, those 56 thought leaders from all over the world, do not believe we're going back to a quote unquote normal. I think we are going to find ourselves waking up in a whole different campus environment with the same old problems, only they become more challenging because we've had no time to react to them. And so think about not being able to go back, and think about what the new normal looks like and how we plan to deal with that, quite frankly. Think about what it means for leadership. We are slated for a record number of retirements across the top level of our institutions nationally. So the number of presidents that will retire over the coming year or so is going to be a record number. And the question is not just who's going to replace those folks from within, but what does the new archetype of the college leader look like? What is that going to sound like? And we heard that a lot on the pod as well. Ed Cabellin and Mordecai Brownlee in episode 9 talked about being agile and being dynamic. Josie Alquist talked about being entrepreneurial. And we've heard that over and over and over again on the podcast, that the next layer of leadership is probably going to be a different archetype of a college leader. And that's one of the things that I want to talk about. Before I pivot to the group that's going to come on stage with me now, and before we welcome them on stage, I'll tell you that if you're an avid listener of the podcast, one of the things that you hear me say every week is you're joining me at my favorite time of the week. It's when I get to hang out with my friends who are cooler and smarter than your friends to talk about the future of higher education. And that's what we're going to do right now is we're going to be joined by Brandon, Elizabeth, and Kelsey. And they're way cooler and smarter than I am. And we're going to talk about the future of higher education if we can do that. So there we go. Get us set up that way. Welcome to all three of you. Thank you for joining me this afternoon here in front of God knows how many people, because we're blasting this out all over the internet. How's everybody doing?
Fantastic.
Doing great. Thanks for having us.
Good. Well, thanks for being here. Kelsey, I want to start with you because I want to go back to this notion of values-driven decision-making. You know, you've talked on the pod a couple times about that. In fact, we in the background of the podcast have already decided every time we say values-driven decision-making, we're going to give you a nickel. It's going to add up fast, I promise you. But you talked about this notion of not being able to be value neutral. And I'd love your perspective on one, what does that mean? Dig a little deeper into that. But two, what does it mean particularly for people that are working in this world, in higher ed adjacency, that are trying to develop projects? How should that impact the work that they do? And what might it mean for the higher ed leader of the future?
Well, first of all, I'm super excited for all those nickels coming my way.
Yeah,
I'll collect them at the
I
end
promise.
of the year. Okay, perfect. So values, right? So that's not a new piece. I think to all of the points you just made leading into this conversation, values have been part of our conversation for years. But what I have continually heard are values that are all very similar: student success, engagement, graduation, right? So we bucket it in these big categories, and everyone's trying to reach those same values. I believe that we are at a point in time where the values need to be broken down even smaller. So when you say student success, what does student success actually mean to you? Does that mean work-ready skills? Does that mean creating a safe and comfortable environment to live in? Does that mean making sure all of their students' basic needs are met so that they can be successful in their academic career? What does student success mean to you? What does it mean to you as a university, college or university? What does that mean to you as a corporation wanting to work with colleges and universities? So get real clear about what those bigger words mean, and then match your actions to those words. So if you say student success means we are going to build and provide a facility that is safe, secure, so students have a home base so that they can be successful in their academic studies. Great. Then do that. Every conversation you're in should be around how you're building a safe and secure space, not about how much money you're going to make, because you didn't say that was your value, right? So values and actions need to be aligned. And then the last thing I'll add to this piece, because I can really talk about it for a long time, is being authentic with it, right? So don't create the value if you don't believe in it. If you really don't believe in safety and security at the core, everyone's going to believe in safety and security. I'm not saying you want people to be a dangerous environment, but what is your top value? What are the actions you're going to choose to make? And then be authentic about it and stick with it. Because that's what our students, and I'd love for Elizabeth, I think the research you have validates this. Students want authentic leaders. They want people to show up in a way. They want people to be truthful, communicate with them, and keep doing that. And so I think you really need to be authentic. So it starts with getting real clear about your values, matching your actions, and continually being authentic about it.
Before I want to get into that data with you, Elizabeth, and hear sort of some of the messaging you think are trends that have come out of the work that you've done at Simpson Scarborough. But before we do that, Brandon, it reminds me of conversations we've had about differentiation across college campuses. And I wonder, we had Sarah Russell from RBC, and she was phenomenal on the pod talking about, from a practical lens, what this could mean for public-private partnerships, as an example, or how this moves some of that math around moving forward, because the outcomes may not be as generically the same. Do you suspect that campuses are going to continue to differentiate a little bit and stop aiming for the middle? And if that's the case, what kind of new challenge is that for all the folks that are working in and around higher education in terms of how they focus their work?
Well, look, I mean, Kelsey kind of led in with this, and I know Elizabeth's going to add to it, but very few higher education brands are fundamentally differentiated to the average prospective college student, or I would even say to alumni from those institutions, right? Like, I know what, we think about when I think about my alma mater, but guess what? I've talked to a lot of other graduates who say the same exact thing about their alma mater. So I sit there and I go, okay, what's really the signature difference? Now, I've always admired brands like Babson, where they have focused on entrepreneurship. They do other things, but entrepreneurship and Babson are synonymous with one another, right? Babson's not a large institution, but it has it has an enlarged presence from a brand perspective because of its focus on a signature area, right? And I think, look, we've made mistakes in the spirit of trying to create comprehensive universities. We're trying to be everything to everybody. And on one hand, I empathize with that desire, but what it does is it ends up diluting some of the things that could really be unique. And if you look at the institutions that are really growing right now, they're very clear on who they're trying to serve. They're very clear on how they're serving them, right? And this goes from the really large institutions like a WGU or a Southern New Hampshire to thriving institutions that are not necessarily large by enrollment, but like a Babson that just has a clear space in the world. So look, I think in the battle to win more students in a shrinking market, and we know it's shrinking on the horizon, it's been shrinking for the last 10 years. Higher ed enrollment and degree seeking programs has been down for 10 consecutive years. It could be down for another 10 if you look at the population age demographic. So look, I don't think there's a choice, right? Differentiation is going to become more difficult to do, and at the same time, mission critical in terms of how I remain relevant as an institution.
So pivoting to you, Elizabeth, and that data and that notion of the trust gap and how it goes, it actually reminds me what you said, Brandon. Someone tweeted the other day, based on all the college admissions brochures that I got, I really suspected I would spend more time sitting on the grass with a very diverse set of friends. And I thought that was really funny because they all kind of do look the same. They're all these very glossy things. And I even heard a rising senior say that the other day about colleges still doing that. And so, Elizabeth, tell us what you've learned about communication through this COVID period, and particularly what that means about this trust gap that we talked about, and what it could mean for those folks that are working in and around higher ed and how they can address it.
Yeah, well, first of all, if Kelsey gets a nickel for every time she says values driven, I want a nickel for every time I say data driven.
Done deal.
Okay, that's fair, right? What was the question?
The question was about the trust gap. What do you know? What have we learned about this trust gap through the work that you've done? And has COVID accelerated that, or just is that really a new problem? Because my hypothesis is there are no new problems. They've just been accelerated and exposed.
No, this is a whole Gen Z thing. Gen Z doesn't trust any authority, right? And so they haven't trusted, and we've been recruiting Gen Z for 5 years now, right? This is not new. Gen Z is not the new population. This is what we've been at. And, as far as communications and marketing go, because that's my specialty. I think what you said at the beginning, TJ, about how there's no U-turn, is absolutely the most important message that we can send. We don't want to go back to the way we used to do things, especially in marketing and communications, and in how we shape and represent our brands in higher education, which is completely related to the differentiation that Brandon was talking about. I mean, COVID has finally yanked higher education into a digital first mentality when it comes to marketing and communications. We need to stay there. We need to stay there and go even further. We should, our clientele was there 15 years ago, right? I mean, these are, this population, they are the true digital natives. They don't even know what a dial-up, modem even sounds like. They've never heard that sound except for in some, kitschy, YouTube video that they think is hilarious and ancient. So we need to take what we've learned through COVID and look at the ways that this has pushed us forward and figure out how we can stay there. There is no going back. We don't want to go back. We don't want to go back to the time when we had a team of admissions counselors that we put on the road for 10 weeks to go visit high schools. I mean, think of the inefficiency and the cost and the dangers that we're putting. I mean, what we were doing was so outmoded. It was unbelievable. So, this is one of the COVID, pandemic silver linings. There are actually a lot of them if you really sit down and think about it. One of the silver linings is that our marketing and communications, we're forced to be more authentic. We're forced to give our target audiences what they want. We're forced to be digital first. All of those things are healthy for higher ed.
So I really appreciate you saying that there's a silver lining. I think there's plenty of them. And I think it is yanking us out of some of those old bad habits and creating new opportunities for us. And I really was hoping to start with a more positive maybe message than I did when my internet failed. So given that sort of positive message, one of my challenges, not to be a Debbie Downer, one of my challenges in the industry has been that, and I applaud higher education, we did well on the reactive phase of this. So if you look back to spring, we did a really nice job. Everybody pivoted online. Everybody sort of dealt with this thing in a pretty timely manner, but that was in reactive phase. Then we had 6 months to prepare for the fall, and we didn't. Right? We didn't do anything different, really, at all. We didn't deliver higher quality online education by and large across the industry. We didn't get a plan together moving forward. And now we're doing the exact same thing for the spring, again, by and large, as an industry. And so do you see any in that silver linings, and this is for everybody, do we see anybody within that silver lining that's actually moving philosophically from being reactive to being proactive in a more powerful way?
Mm. Well, you know what? I'm going to get a little defensive about higher ed, TJ. I've told you many times that, I have 4 kids in college right now. And honestly, when I dropped them all off on campuses or sent them off, all packed up because I wasn't even allowed to go drop them off, I was saying, see you in a couple of weeks. And all 4 of those kids are still on their campuses and they're not coming home till November 20th. I actually think there's a lot to celebrate there. I mean, they've, just the fact that they're there. The bar is low this year, right? I just want them there. I want them plugged in. And so I think there is actually a lot to celebrate and a lot to say for the fact that, one of my kids is at Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. There hasn't been a COVID case on that campus for 3 weeks.
Wow.
I want to send my parents to live at Franklin and Marshall. I mean, this is the safest place on the planet, right? And so, that's not to say that there's not there's not a lot more work to be done. But there's a lot to celebrate too. I sound like a Pollyanna on this.
No. Because I've seen on LinkedIn, you say an awful lot of positive things, particularly about the institutions that your kids are attending. And I think one of the lessons learned for me when I take that glass half empty perspective sometimes, I think one of the things that I take from that is that we've learned that different university environments call for different responses to a worldwide pandemic. And unfortunately, we work in a follower industry where everybody tried to do the same thing. And what we learned was you can't do the same thing, which to me takes us down the road of there will be differentiation in this industry. And as the differentiation continues, the way that we work across the industry has to be completely different. And I could get into a conversation about even how we hire people. In my field of student affairs, we tend to put a group of grads all in one big room and ask them to tell every institution why they're a perfect fit there, which assumes that all those institutions are exactly the same, and they're not. We really need to be better at the whole differentiation conversation. So, Kelsey, you want to say something?
I do. So I think, thinking about the time frame and the way you've laid out the quick reaction in the spring, the lack of maybe change or innovation over the summer, if I put words in your mouth, and then the way fall happens, is I think that actually speaks to that follower industry. It's, hey, we're quick to act. We're going to move. We can move when it's quick and it's urgent. We can do that. I think campuses are really good in emergency situations always, small or large emergencies. Right. So this was just a really large emergency that everyone went through. I think campuses have always been good at that, and they showed that. Campuses are not good at moving quickly around business decisions, around procurement, around the way in which teaching happens. They're just not good at it, period. We as humans struggle with change, but say we like change. And so how do you do both of those pieces? And when everything was changing at once, I feel like it was hard for campuses to focus on what to change first. So either they changed everything, they changed nothing, and then everyone had this fear that if I'm the campus that opens up, a student dies on my campus because of COVID, an employee on my campus dies because of COVID, that's on me, right? And then everyone else is going to look to or blame or shame or whatever that looks like. And so I think we had this combination of so much changing, the uncertainty of change, and then the fear of what could happen if we make the wrong decision. And so I just think when you're a leader and you have all of those things coupled together, it's really hard. And the pressure behind that is difficult. And I think the leadership of campuses holistically have held
you
that.
are segueing it beautifully. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Yeah, you know what, Kelsey, you know what's interesting? Everyone's talking about the mental health of our students. I'm worried about the mental health of the college administration.
Yep.
Honestly, I've talked to more of my friends and clients who work in, presidents and vice presidents who are so stressed out and stretched thin and literally at their wits' end that I worry about them from, personally. I mean, being in a situation where you have to make decisions, you have to make them fast, and there are no rights. Right? You can't be confident that what you're doing is the right thing. It is an enormously stressful situation. And it really makes me, worry about the support that they're getting. We're talking about, are the students getting support? The administration needs support too, because they are really struggling.
Well, and part of that goes back to some things that we've talked about on the podcast, which is this notion that the environment of higher education and being authentic and being a little bit more less risk averse may open up the doors to be able to move a little bit more quickly or to be able to make mistakes and fail forward. But the industry is going to have to change for that to happen. I can point to very few college leaders. And Terry Flannery and I had a conversation yesterday about this. She's got a book coming out on that will be the resource on marketing and higher education when it comes out in January. Pick it up. It's going to be phenomenal. But she talked about that tension. And we talked about, you've got your chief marketing officer who knows about authenticity and connecting with your audience and those types of things. And then we have our college presidents who have just been trained to be risk averse. And take make sure we don't say the wrong thing. And there are very few exceptions that I can point to out there. And so I think the industry's got to move a little bit. And that pivots me to the next big question, which is that archetype of the college leader. And Brandon, you, last time we talked about the splintering of the archetype of the student, which I thought was a really interesting concept as it's going to relate to informing the differentiation for institutions. But I'd also like to hear sort of what does that mean for the archetype of the college leader in your mind?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think I echo some of the comments that Elizabeth and Kelsey said around, higher ed has done a good job responding to an emergency, right? Like, it could have gone far worse. I mean, but what's happened, of course, is those leaders have been utterly consumed by not just one emergency. We've talked about the pandemic, but multiple emergencies, right? Mm-hmm. We think about Black Lives Matter and all the different issues that are brought front and center on a university campus, right, virtually or otherwise. I mean, we've had one thing after another. So what's happened is, rightfully so, understandably, leaders have been utterly consumed by the here and now, right? What has happened though is that they've very few have been able to carve out any time for looking on the horizon and really thinking about how they catapult into that innovation world, right? When you're spinning all these plates, trying to deal with all these important emergencies, that's a really difficult thing to do. But I've seen examples of where it's been done really well. And in simple terms, what they've done is they have named a place and a space and a person for innovation. So I think about a Wake Forest University. They actually have a committee, an established committee on their board of trustees focused on innovation. They have a vice president of innovation that sits on the cabinet, on the president's cabinet, right? This is just one of a handful of examples where the institution has kind of named innovation as one of its key goals, and they've put people and committees and governance around that idea, right? So I think there's a way to do this, but leaders are going to have to carve out that time. And for college presidents in particular, it's almost like exercise, right? If you don't schedule it on your calendar, sometimes you don't do it. They need to schedule innovation and the horizon on their calendar. I know that sounds like a really silly tactical notion, but like the concept of that is what has to happen. And I think what's going to evolve, to your point, TJ, is we're going to see a new era of leaders in higher ed, right? I'll call them entrepreneurs, higher ed entrepreneurs. So let's put an H in front of it and call them entrepreneurs as a little. Elizabeth, see how that tests with some of your market research.
You coined it. You've just written your next article. That's great.
But I had to throw something silly in there. But there's going to be kind of two types. There's going to be the survivalists and the opportunists, right? The survivalists are going to come from institutions that have no other option but to innovate to stay alive, right? They're the ones that are literally facing an existential crisis right now. And then there's going to be the opportunists who just focus on the future, right? And realize there's so many opportunities for higher education to expand its mission beyond degree programs to non-degree education, beyond, as we've talked about, the traditional undergrads to non-traditional, serving their communities in new innovative ways, thinking about how they can be a service to a family, not just an individual student. I've never seen more opportunities for higher ed, but unfortunately we need to kind of create that space for entrepreneurship and innovation. And in some respects, it's going to be a requirement that the leadership at the helm is probably going to be a change that will necessitate that. So I don't know who those people are going to be necessarily, but I do think you're going to see it on both ends. The survivalists who have no choice, you know, necessity is the mother of all invention. And then you're going to see those who are just in that, you know, horizon planning mode and are activating on it.
I'm really interested in how this is all going to play out. Brandon, you work with a lot of college presidents and suspect you have a good sort of finger on the pulse of how people are feeling and where they're going to go. And Elizabeth, you had mentioned mental health. And sometimes I wonder, who the hell's going to want these jobs? Who's going to want these very, very challenging jobs, unless there's some sort of fundamental shift to make it a sphere where you can be more entrepreneurial, whether it be from an opportunistic perspective or that survivalist perspective that you talked about. And I think that's a really, really great framework. So I want to shift gears. We always love to end on opportunities when we're on the podcast. And I want to hear about opportunities from each of you, but I want to ask it from a very, very specific lens. If you were to give advice, our audience today is really sort of a 50-50. We've got higher ed folks and we've got folks who are working around higher education. And so if you were to give advice for one thing, one big opportunity as it relates to people that are working within higher education, that if they were going to position themselves strategically to be in a good spot when we do find ourselves in campus 2030, long before 2030, what would that advice be? And then for those folks who are working alongside higher ed, those people who are trying to chase RFPs and do deals and trying to really advance public-private partnership work, what would your advice be to them?
Mine would be to try to retain some of the agility that you found in 2020. That's the gift that 2020 gave us. They gave us COVID, and that's shit, but it also gave us this understanding that we, and feeling that we can be agile. And if we go back and in 2021, we lose that agility, it's going to be such a crime, because, our problems, like you said, they existed before COVID, they will exist after. Just because the pandemic is over doesn't mean all of our problems go away. Did everyone forget about the demographic cliff that's coming? Boy, weren't we talking about that all last year? Haven't heard a peep about it this year, right? Like it's not happening. It's still happening. We need to completely rethink what we're doing. We need to think about the programs we're offering. We need to think about whether or not they're relevant to today's students, whether they're getting kids the kinds of jobs that are in demand out there. We need to think how we're delivering them. We need to rethink all of that. And so I think the biggest opportunity is retain the agility that your institution has, and don't allow your institution to only exhibit that agility when you're in the midst of a crisis. If we're going to really survive and thrive well into the future, we have got to be entrepreneurial.
I love it. We're already using it. That is fantastic. That's fantastic. Kelsey or Brandon, whomever, jump in and let us know, what is the one opportunity, if you were to give somebody a one opportunity advice on either side, what would that be?
I'll jump in. So I'm going to bundle a big piece of advice. So I think it all boils down to courageous leadership. So those of you that listen to Brene Brown out there, listen, believe, follow, but this idea of courageous leadership, how we show up in power with versus power over other people, this idea that we are working together in true partnership to move forward, and how we are rewarding and holding folks accountable. Because I think this idea to be a courageous leader at any level of the organization, whether you're on a campus or you're in the corporate world, we need leaders at all levels of the organization, and they need to be rewarded for being courageous, for thinking differently, for moving the needle. And so I think leadership at the top that maybe holds position power needs to allow for failure, allow for courageous decisions, allow for trying things differently so that we can move forward and they can, in their leadership position, kind of move the ship, if you will, in a different direction.
Some of the things that really stood out to me there, I actually recently tweeted that part of the issue in higher education is we are a culture of blame, not a culture of accountability. And when you talk about moving from blame to accountability, I think that is a fundamental shift in the industry that will have meaningful impacts to the way that we're able to be effective. I think that's really important. Brandon, what about you? What is the one opportunity, whether you're on this side or that side, that people ought to be focused on?
Well, we've touched on it in various ways, right? And I don't think these two things are different. I see them as really interconnected, and that is what I think of as mission diversification and revenue diversification. They're one and the same thing, right? And if we think, I'll just use the example of the typical 4-year traditional university that serves 18 to 22-year-olds. If we think that's a growing market in the United States, forget about it, right? If you start to think about online traditional undergrads, wow, that's a little more provocative. Most people haven't gone after that. We've gone after online bachelor's degrees for non-traditional students, but there's a whole emerging opportunity for that. We could go on with examples, but I think it is getting outside the mindset of like, this is what we do and serve, right? And saying, actually, if we just broaden our notion of that a little bit, if we broaden our definition of education, we get outside of thinking that the only thing we can deliver is degrees, and we start thinking about all the incredible valuable education short of a degree that, by the way, I think universities can and should be involved in, right? So we know the business model is challenged, and I think the mission is challenged, and it relates to several of the points that both Kelsey and Elizabeth have made about authenticity, about brand identity, all that kind of stuff. But I would simplify it to say mission diversification and revenue diversification, and to make sure those two things are aligned, right, in terms of what we're doing. So in other words, there's a lot of revenue sources that university could go pursue that have very little attachment to mission. And there's some mission opportunities we could do that will just continue to tank our financials. I mean, yeah, you can afford to do a little of those things, but it's the convergence of those two that we really need to focus on.
Do you think, as an aside, that the incentives for leadership might change? When I think about the average tenure of a college president, it's 5 to 7 years. And during that time, it really feels like the incentive is don't screw it up, right? Let's keep retention okay. Let's keep enrollment okay. And let's go get some money. But there's really not an incentive to fail forward at all. Do you see that changing at all?
Well, I tell you, I'll just say, I talked about the survivalists and opportunists that are going to be out there. The other category, I'm not going to call them entrepreneurs. They're going to be the establishment elites. They're going to try to do what we've all said shouldn't be done, which is to get back to the normal. And you know what? That may work for a small handful of the most established elite institutions. I still don't think it's the right strategy for them, right? But I definitely think, the establishment elites are going to try and do what you just said, TJ. Just don't mess it up, right? We got a good thing going. We're already at the top of the pile. Just don't mess it up, right? Which is also to say, don't be too innovative or crazy or creative, right? So I really think, what I'm most excited about for higher ed is watching the rest of those institutions, the survivalists and opportunists, right, doing things that will truly inspire all of us and get us to a place where, we don't get back to the normal. We catapult into a very different higher education, one that for many years has probably been needed for a long time. If we just align more to what students want, we align more to what the employers are asking for. These are things that can be done. So I'm encouraged overall. But yeah, to your point, some incentives are going to have to change, right? Because fundraising dollars for new buildings, I'm not so sure that's going to be a huge priority. Building more partnerships with employers who offer to fund a degree for their employees from my university. That sounds like something that would be pretty wise to invest in. Let's put some targets against that.
I love it. And I'm going to misquote this, but it reminds me, Michael Sorrell actually tweeted recently that the institutions that'll win will be the ones who value tradition less than they value their students. And I think that's a really, really interesting sort of framework to look at. So I want to thank the three of you. I want to encourage our folks who are watching, whether it be watching through the P3 Summit, watching on our live stream, or that listen to this later as a podcast, to read what the three of you are doing, to follow you on social media, because you're all the thought leaders. You're the reason that this session makes any sense at all. I want to leave it with one quote from Jim Harris. Jim Harris is the president at the University of San Diego. We had him on the pod, and he had a lot of impact on me. And one of the things he said, I want to make sure I get the quote right, was that we are at a liminal moment in higher education. This is a moment of disorder, but a moment for us to embrace. And I hope that we'll do it. So I want to thank all of you for being here. I want to thank all of our listeners. I want to thank Tyson and the P3 Higher Ed Summit for having us. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
TJ, thank you so much. And also special thanks to Elizabeth, Kelsey, and Brandon for helping us kick things off and keeping on time too. It's interesting. We will have typically 10 to 15 minute spaces in between sessions. So the next block will begin 15 minutes after the hour. But I'd recommend spending this time to click around, to explore, to connect, see who's here. Again, on the navigation bar, you can see who's online right now. Check out the expo hall. Also, please introduce yourself. Let everyone know that you're here because by participating, you're contributing. And, we'll see you again from here on through the rest of the day. We'll have concurrent sessions as part of each block in the program. And you'll see this morning, we sent the full event guide, but you can also access that in the Resource Center. So if you have any questions, please visit the help guide, and we will see you all later. Thanks.